September 15, 1944, Peleliu. Dawn never truly arrives here. It forces its way through the smoke. The first light of morning bleeds across the shattered jungle, revealing splintered palms, twisted coral, and the blackened ribs of yesterday's battlefield. The air tastes of salt, ash, and something metallic that clings to the tongue. Even the wind seems afraid to move. Inside a cramped limestone tunnel carved into Bloody Nose Ridge, Japanese soldiers wait in suffocating darkness. Sweat runs down their backs. Their hearts beat louder than their breaths. No one dares speak. No one dares shift a single stone, because every man here knows the Americans are coming. At first, there is only a tremble beneath their feet, a vibration, a warning. Then, the island erupts. A wall of sound tears through the morning, not a volley, not artillery, but a solid sheet of gunfire. Millions of rounds pouring forward like a metallic hurricane. Tracers streak so thick they look like molten rivers cutting through the palm trees. Machine guns bark in overlapping waves until the noise stops being gunfire and becomes something else. A storm of bullets strong enough to change the shape of the land. In that moment, one thought spreads among the defenders. No human army should be able to fire this much. And yet, the Americans are only getting started. By mid-1944, the Pacific was no longer the scattered island war it had been in 1942. The United States had transformed it into a systematic, crushing advance, one island, one airfield, one fortress at a time. What began as a desperate struggle after Pearl Harbor had evolved into a machine of logistics, industry, and relentless firepower unlike anything Imperial Japan had ever imagined. The turning points had already come and gone. Midway, Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. With each campaign, the U.S. refined a brutal principle: overwhelm everything. Not just with numbers, not just with ships, with ammunition. Tons of it, mountains of it. Enough bullets, shells, rockets, and bombs to turn a single square mile of jungle into a cratered wasteland. By 1944, American Marines and Army infantry no longer advanced cautiously through foliage. They moved behind a curtain of fire. Every maneuver was supported by naval guns offshore, artillery batteries inland, and aircraft circling above. Every squad carried Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, Garans, bazookas, and more ammunition than any other army could dream of supplying. And behind them stood something far more important: the American industrial engine. Factories from Pennsylvania to California were running day and night, pouring out crates of ammunition at a pace Japan could not match in a year. If a Marine division requested 1 million rounds for an operation, the ammunition would already be on ships steaming west. If they expended it in a day, replacements were loaded the next morning. The Pacific Islands were small, tiny dots of coral and volcanic rock, but the scale of firepower used to take them was colossal. Each assault required naval bombardments that shook the sea, airstrikes that blackened entire ridges, and infantry attacks supported by such dense machine gun fire that Japanese commanders began documenting it as beyond measurement. Meanwhile, Imperial Japan was fighting a different kind of war entirely. Cut off by a tightening American naval blockade, their ammunition stockpiles dwindled. Factories in the home island struggled under bombings and resource shortages. The Japanese soldier on the front line often carried as few as 60 to 120 rounds, barely enough for minutes of sustained combat. Rifles that were once carefully preserved were now used sparingly. Machine guns were hidden deep in caves to conserve ammunition. Every round mattered. Every burst was a decision. The Americans had no such restraint. Their doctrine was clear. Suppress everything. Crush every position. Keep firing until movement stops. This difference grew catastrophic on Peleliu.
The island was one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific, shaped by miles of limestone ridges, caves, tunnels, coral outcroppings, and concealed fortifications. Japanese General Kunio Nakagawa turned it into a labyrinth designed to bleed the U.S. Marine Corps dry. He ordered his troops to abandon beach banzai charges and instead fight from hidden, interconnected strongpoints meant to trap the Americans in a slow, grinding battle. It was a strategy that relied on endurance, on patience, on surviving long enough to inflict maximum casualties. But endurance means nothing when the enemy brings enough fire to level a mountain. To the Americans, Peleliu was another stepping stone toward the Philippines. To the Japanese, it was a final stand, a chance to prove that determination could overcome industrial might. Yet as the Marines landed, they brought with them a level of ammunition previously unseen in the Pacific. Every Marine carried extra bandoliers. Every machine gun team hauled belt after belt of .30 caliber rounds. Mortar crews were overloaded. Ammunition carriers shuttled constantly from the rear. Offshore, U.S. Navy destroyers and battleships tracked targets with precision. Inland, artillery batteries were registered on every ridge. Above, corsairs and helldivers circled, armed with rockets and 500-pound bombs. This was not fire support. This was annihilation. And for Japanese troops sealed inside caves on Peleliu, the realization came slowly. The Americans were firing so many bullets that counting them was meaningless. Ammunition logs from U.S. units later confirmed what Axis survivors had claimed. Millions of rounds were expended in the first phase of the battle alone. That is the world into which those defenders awoke on September 15, 1944. A world where firepower had become a physical presence, as real as heat or wind. And as dawn turned to day, the true scale of that firestorm began to reveal itself. If the Pacific War had taught the Japanese anything by late 1944, it was this: the Americans did not run out of ammunition. Not at sea, not in the air, and certainly not on land. Nowhere was this more evident than on Peleliu, an island barely 6 miles long, shaped like a crooked claw of coral jutting from the sea. From above, it looked insignificant, a scrap of land lost among the thousands scattered across the Pacific. But to the U.S. High Command, it was a crucial link in the chain leading toward the Philippines and ultimately the Japanese home islands. To the Japanese, Peleliu became something else entirely: a fortress of sacrifice. General Kunio Nakagawa, a calm and analytical commander, viewed the island not as a place to win, but as a place to delay. If his garrison of roughly 10,000 men could slow the U.S. advance even by a few weeks, it would be considered a strategic success. To achieve that, he turned Peleliu's interior into a maze. The Umurbrogel Mountains, a jagged cluster of coral ridges and razor-sharp limestone, were riddled with tunnels, spider holes, and hidden firing chambers. Each position was connected to another, allowing defenders to fire, disappear, and reappear at a different angle. Heavy machine guns were placed behind natural rock cover, protected from naval shell fire. Artillery pieces were dragged deep into caves so only their barrels protruded. Mortar teams operated from chambers where sound vanished into the stone. This network allowed the Japanese to endure bombings that would have obliterated any conventional trench line. But it carried a flaw Nakagawa could not fix. The defenders had limited ammunition. Many soldiers had fewer than 100 rifle rounds. Machine gun crews carried belts that were precious, irreplaceable, and terrifyingly finite. Mortar shells were rationed. Grenades were counted. Every bullet had to be used with intent. Then came the Americans. The 1st Marine Division, battle-hardened from Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, approached Peleliu with firepower no defending force could truly comprehend. Their doctrine emphasized overwhelming suppression, and Peleliu's terrain demanded even more. Narrow ridges, blind corners, underground chambers and snaking coral spines created ambush zones everywhere. The only safe way forward was to fill every dark opening with fire. And so they did. Machine guns were rarely idle. Mortars fired relentlessly. Bar gunners swept ridgelines with methodical discipline. Squads learned quickly that shadows on Peleliu were dangerous, and the only reliable answer was to fire into them until no movement remained. Even before the landings, the scale of American firepower stunned the Japanese. Naval bombardment pulverized the beaches, sending coral fragments flying like shrapnel. Battleships unleashed shells that shook entire hillsides. Destroyers raked suspected machine gun nests with streams of heavy-caliber rounds. Aircraft dropped bombs large enough to dislodge cave roofs. But Nakagawa's defensive network survived. It always survived. That was the problem. Every time U.S. Marines silenced one machine gun nest, 2 more opened fire from new angles. Every time a cave mouth collapsed, defenders emerged from another tunnel to reoccupy the position. Every time the Americans cleared a ridge, hidden snipers struck from above. The Marines had no choice but to fire back, constantly, aggressively, without pause. Ammunition crates vanished faster on Peleliu than on almost any Pacific battlefield before it. By the 2nd day, resupply teams were drenched in sweat, their shoulders digging into wooden crates as they hauled thousands of pounds of ammunition through the choking heat. Tracer boxes emptied. Machine gun belts were fed into barrels so hot that they glowed faintly in the shade. Rifle companies went through twice their expected daily allotments. Mortar tubes fired until crews feared they would warp. In one Marine regiment, officers recorded the staggering reality. Some companies fired more than 100,000 rounds in a matter of hours. For the Japanese, deep inside their caves, the sheer volume of American fire became surreal. Bullets clattered against rock like metallic rain. Coral dust filled the air until breathing became painful. Even inside fortified chambers, fragments of stone erupted from ricochets, slicing through skin. There were moments when the sound of gunfire merged into a single, relentless roar, more storm than battle. It became clear to many defenders, this was not a fight between soldiers. It was a clash between flesh and industry. Peleliu was small. Its ridges were narrow. Its caves were packed with men who had nowhere to retreat, which meant that every hour, every engagement, every ridge assaulted by the Marines required ammunition expenditure on an unprecedented scale. And as the battle moved deeper into the Umur American firepower reached levels the Japanese had never before experienced or believed possible. In that dark, suffocating maze, the stage was set for a confrontation defined not only by courage, but by mathematics. A battle where millions of bullets would determine survival, and where every angle of warfare would reveal an even more sobering truth.
For the Japanese infantrymen on Peleliu, survival was no longer a matter of bravery. It was a matter of enduring something that felt inhuman. Their defensive doctrine had prepared them for artillery barrages, for naval bombardments, even for tanks. But nothing in their training, nothing in their experience in China, the Philippines, or New Guinea had prepared them for the volume of fire that the Americans unleashed. Inside the honeycomb caves of the Bergall, men learned to navigate darkness by touch alone. The smell of damp limestone mixed with sweat. Air became thick, stale, suffocating. Each man clutched his last handful of cartridges, knowing replenishment would never come. The moment they fired, they were gambling with their own longevity. Then, the Americans arrived. When machine gun fire swept the ridges, it sounded like sheets of steel ripping apart. The caves trembled as bullets tore across their openings. Every crevice of coral became a source of ricochets. Fragments cut through skin like glass. Men pressed themselves into corners so tight their shoulders bruised against the rock. Some soldiers described the noise as a continuous scream. Others said the Americans fired so many bullets that the air vibrated, as if the entire mountain were humming. As hours turned into days, defenders realized a truth that chilled them more than the heat ever could. They were no longer fighting soldiers. They were withstanding an industrial storm. This psychological shock shaped every moment of the battle that followed. To understand why millions of bullets were fired on Peleliu, one must understand the American tactical mindset at this stage of the war. After brutal lessons in the Solomons and on Tarawa, U.S. forces adopted a principle that redefined small unit combat. Suppress everything that could possibly hide an enemy. This doctrine was not theoretical. It was born from tragedy. Too many Marines had been lost to hidden snipers, camouflage positions, and ambushes in jungles where the enemy could appear from any angle. Peleliu's serrated ridges and cavernous interiors amplified these dangers tenfold. So the Marines responded with math, not mercy. If a cave was suspected, it was fired into. If a shadow moved, it was suppressed. If a ridge looked suspicious, it was swept with full automatic fire. Machine gun teams laid overlapping fields of fire that turned entire slopes into kill zones. Bar gunners, operating with precision and aggression, walked rounds across boulders and brush. Mortar crews assumed every depression hid a tunnel entrance. Even riflemen practiced fire discipline not by shooting sparingly, but by shooting consistently to keep the enemy pinned. The goal was simple: deny the Japanese the ability to breathe, move, or reposition. This tactic consumed ammunition at staggering rates, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Peleliu's terrain was not merely difficult. It was engineered by nature to amplify the cruelty of war. The Bergall ridges consisted of spiked coral formations that rose in chaotic angles. No straight lines, no open fields, no predictable approaches. Every ridge had smaller ridges branching from it. Every cave had tunnels splitting into more caverns. It was a three-dimensional battlefield. For the attacking Marines, every foot of ground demanded overwhelming fire just to survive. A single coral outcropping could hide a platoon. A cave mouth could be invisible from a few yards away. A sniper positioned inside a deep chamber could fire without revealing his position. Normal infantry tactics broke down here. Flanking was impossible in many places. Retreat paths were narrow. Visibility was routinely measured in feet, not yards. And then there were the echoes. Gunfire inside the Bergall reverberated violently. A single burst from a machine gun sounded like multiple sources firing simultaneously. Marines often couldn't distinguish between an active threat and an acoustic illusion. Their response? Fire more, suppress more, clear every angle with maximum force. The Japanese exploited the terrain masterfully. But that mastery came with a cost. Every hidden position forced the Americans to expend hundreds, sometimes thousands of rounds just to neutralize a single threat. Multiply that by hundreds of caves and firing points, and the result was a battle where ammunition flowed like water. In this unforgiving landscape, high expenditure was not excess. It was survival. And these combined perspectives form the foundation for the next phase of the narrative.
Behind every Marine pulling a trigger on Peleliu stood an entire nation built for war.
The United States did not simply outnumber Japan on the battlefield, it outproduced it on an industrial scale so vast that Axis intelligence repeatedly refused to believe the numbers. Factories in Missouri, Ohio, Michigan, and California ran day and night, powered by a workforce larger than the entire Japanese army. Ammunition plants alone produced billions of rounds each year. Conveyor belts fed machines stamping brass casings at a pace so fast that the defective rate was less than 1 in 1,000. Railroads carried crates to ports in a never-ending flow. Cargo ships sailed in convoys, each one packed with millions of rounds destined for island battles most Americans had never heard of. This system meant that Marines on Peleliu could fight without hesitation. They didn't save ammunition, they didn't ration bullets, they didn't fire sparingly. The logistics chain behind them ensured that when a rifleman emptied his bandolier, another crate was already on the beach. Japan couldn't match this, not in 1944 and not in any foreseeable future. Their factories were starved of steel, copper, fuel, and manpower. American B-29 raids destroyed workshops faster than they could rebuild them. Every month, more of Japan's industrial cities were reduced to smoking rubble. The imbalance was absolute. So when Marines fired millions of rounds on Peleliu, it wasn't waste, it wasn't excess. It was the natural expression of an industrial giant focused entirely on one goal, winning the Pacific. The Japanese defenders felt that imbalance in every ricochet and every shaking cave wall. The Battle of Peleliu became a collision not just of armies, but of philosophies, personified by two commanders whose visions could not have been more different. On the Japanese side stood Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, architect of the island's labyrinth defense. Calm, methodical, and deeply committed, he rejected the wasteful banzai charges that had doomed previous garrisons. Instead, he embraced a defensive doctrine focused on endurance. His troops were instructed to survive bombardment, conserve ammunition, and fight from concealed positions where a single bullet could stop an advancing Marine. His goal was not victory, it was attrition, buying time with blood. Opposite him was Major General Rupert Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division. He believed Peleliu would fall quickly, famously predicting a battle of 3 or 4 days. His optimism, shaped by victories in earlier island campaigns, collided violently with the unprecedented defenses awaiting his men. Yet whether Rupertus underestimated the island or not, his Marines fought according to the American doctrine, refined by bitter experience. Crush resistance through overwhelming fire. The casualty list from Buna, Tarawa, and Cape Gloucester had taught them hard lessons. They no longer attempted cautious approaches against fortified Japanese positions. If a cave fired once, it was hit with rifles, BARs, machine guns, mortars, flamethrowers, grenades, and rockets, often all at once. Nakagawa's men were disciplined, patient, and incredibly skilled at defensive warfare, but they were trapped in a doctrine that required firepower the Japanese Empire could no longer supply. Thus the clash became cruelly symbolic. One commander relied on human resilience, the other relied on industrial might. Only one of those could shape the battlefield of 1944. War is often described in terms of courage, strategy, or sacrifice, but Peleliu forced both sides to confront a far more uncomfortable reality. What happens when firepower grows so immense that human effort no longer matters? The Japanese defenders fought with extraordinary determination. They dug, endured, and resisted in conditions that would have broken many armies. They believed deeply in their duty and held fast to the idea that determination could overcome material disadvantage. But on Peleliu, that belief met its limit. The Americans, for all their discipline and bravery, wielded a level of force that bordered on impersonal. A machine gun burst didn't target a man, it targeted an entire hillside. Mortar barrages weren't aimed at individuals, they sealed cave mouths, vaporized vegetation, and shook the ground like thunder. This imbalance raised questions that lingered long after the battle ended. Was this simply the nature of modern war?
Was overwhelming fire the only way to break fortified positions? What happens to the human experience when war becomes a contest of production rather than will? For the Japanese, the moral weight was heavier. They fought with finite ammunition, finite reinforcements, finite options, and yet infinite expectation from their nation. Their courage was undeniable, but courage is not a weapon. On POV, courage met firepower, and firepower won. This moral reckoning became one of the defining legacies of the battle, a reminder that bravery can illuminate history, but industry can reshape it. And as both sides pushed deeper into the jagged ridges, this imbalance set the stage for a climax unlike anything seen in the Pacific up to that point.
September 17, 1944, Peleliu, Umurbrogol Ridge. The sun had climbed higher, but the jungle offered no warmth, only a stifling, smoke-choked haze. Coral dust filled the air, whipped up by constant gunfire and a repeated concussion of naval shells. The Marines advanced in disciplined waves, each step measured, deliberate, methodical. Every ridge, every knoll, every shadow held the potential for death. Nakagawa's defenders had learned to use the terrain to their advantage. They fired from hidden positions, emerging only briefly to discharge a single, carefully aimed shot before vanishing into the labyrinth of caves. But even this skill met its limit. The Americans had not come to meet bullets with bullets. They had come to drown every hiding place in metal. From the first light of day, the volume of fire was relentless. Machine gun teams opened sweeping arcs across the ridges. BAR gunners advanced, spraying suppressive fire into every suspected hiding place. Riflemen emptied bandoliers as grenades shattered cave mouths. Mortars rained down with unerring precision. Naval guns pounded the hillsides from offshore, sending fragments of coral into the air like shrapnel storms. Fighter planes strafed every ridge, their machine guns cutting arcs of orange tracer through the smoke. It was not a fight. It was a siege conducted entirely by bullets. Every tunnel that had withstood days of bombing, every strong point carefully carved into the coral began to crumble. Caves collapsed under the weight of constant fire. Ventilation shafts clogged with debris. Fragments of rock and lead tore through flesh and bone indiscriminately. Inside one tunnel, a Japanese machine gun crew fired until their barrels glowed. Their last belts of ammunition vanished in minutes. When the Americans approached, grenades were hurled into the chamber. The surviving soldiers retreated further into the cave, only to encounter another hailstorm of gunfire from overlapping fields of suppression. The numbers are staggering. Logs recovered from Marine units later recorded that in less than 48 hours, over 2 million rounds had been expended on a single battlefield, and this was only the opening phase. Rifles, BARs, Thompson submachine guns, machine guns, mortars, every weapon had contributed to an unbroken wall of bullets. Yet it was not merely quantity, it was precision and coordination. Fire teams advanced in perfect rhythm. Every burst, every belt, every shot was accounted for in the choreography of suppression. Japanese soldiers had nowhere to escape. Every exit point, every ridge, every opening was covered. Amid this storm, the defenders began to understand a terrifying truth. Resistance was mathematically impossible. No amount of courage, training, or ingenuity could overcome the sheer volume of fire directed at them. One survivor later recalled the moment when a ridge they had defended for days simply disappeared under fire. Machine gun nests were obliterated. Cave entrances collapsed. Snipers fell. Every attempt to regroup or counterattack was met with torrents of bullets. The Americans moved not as men, but as a coordinated force of steel and ammunition, relentless and unstoppable. And yet, for all its mechanical precision, the Marines faced risk. Every slope held the potential for an unseen sniper. Every collapsed cave could conceal survivors ready to strike. Every misstep could cost lives. But the training, discipline, and industrial support behind them ensured that firepower would prevail. By late afternoon, Nakagawa's positions had begun to crumble systematically. The famous Bloody Nose Ridge was no longer a stronghold. It was a battlefield scoured clean by bullets, shells, and smoke. What remained were pockets of resistance, desperate men clinging to caves now reduced to tombs, and the relentless, methodical advance of the 1st Marine Division. The Americans had achieved what Japanese intelligence had long feared, a perfect storm of firepower, coordination, and supply that made any defensive position, no matter how fortified, ultimately untenable. The stage was set for the final collapse. The defenders' endurance had met the limits of human possibility. The mountains, tunnels, and caves that had promised sanctuary were now death traps. Every angle of the battlefield had been methodically suppressed. Every movement was met with a torrent of lead. And yet, the battle was not yet over. The next hours would decide the fate of the island, the casualties on both sides, and etch Peleliu into history as one of the most horrifying demonstrations of industrial firepower ever witnessed in human warfare. September 18, 1944. The fall of Umabrogol Ridge. By the second full day of the assault, Peleliu had transformed into a living inferno. Smoke rose in thick, gray columns, weaving through shattered coral ridges. The air was heavy with dust, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. Every sound was magnified, the pop of rifles, the staccato of machine guns, the thunder of mortars, and the deep booms of naval guns offshore. It was deafening, unrelenting, and omnipresent. Nakagawa's carefully orchestrated defenses were beginning to collapse. Trenches and tunnels that had withstood previous bombardments were now breached, their entrances destroyed by concentrated fire. Japanese soldiers moved cautiously, seeking cover wherever they could find it. But every ridge, every outcropping, every cave mouth was swept with bullets. Every movement risked annihilation. Marine squads advanced systematically. Fire teams coordinated across ridges. Overlapping arcs ensured no defender could fire without being immediately suppressed. Mortar crews calculated distances with surgical precision, landing shells directly on suspected positions. Naval guns continued in parallel, ripping apart reinforced coral bunkers. Fighter bombers strafed from above, leaving trails of tracer that lit the sky like molten threads. It was not a fight. It was a siege conducted entirely by bullets. A single Japanese cave might hold 10 men, but the Americans fired hundreds of rounds at it. When grenades were thrown inside and machine guns swept the interior, few emerged alive. Survivors retreated deeper into tunnels that had become suffocating, claustrophobic death traps. The roar of bullets was ceaseless, a mechanical storm that no human endurance could withstand. Casualty reports from the American side recorded hundreds of enemy killed in small sectors and even more wounded, trapped, or incapacitated. Ammunition expenditure skyrocketed. Some units reported using over 50,000 rounds in just one ridge-clearing operation, and this was repeated across multiple ridges simultaneously. By the end of the second day, estimates suggested that well over 2 million rounds had been fired across the entire battlefield. Despite this, Nakagawa's men continued to fight with remarkable discipline.
Snipers emerged briefly from tunnels to harass advancing Marines. Machine gun crews, when barrels cooled, fired again. Flamethrower teams forced them to abandon some positions, but every surrender came only after prolonged and brutal suppression. Yet the tide was irreversible. The coordination of firepower, the endless supply of ammunition, and the unyielding training of the Marines combined into an unstoppable force. Terrain that once favored the defenders now became their trap. Each ridge they had fortified was systematically cleared with overwhelming fire. Every tunnel and cave was neutralized or destroyed.
By afternoon, Bloody Nose Ridge, the symbolic heart of the Japanese defense, had fallen. Marines raised flags on key positions, though the ground was still littered with the remnants of destroyed bunkers, coral, and equipment. The roar of gunfire had finally diminished in some sectors, replaced by the stench of smoke and the groans of the wounded. Nakabawa's strategy of attrition had bought time, but the Americans had simply outlasted them. What the Japanese had considered an impenetrable fortress had proven vulnerable to sheer volume of fire and relentless assault. The calculation was stark. Courage and endurance could not withstand millions of bullets, artillery shells, and bombs delivered in coordinated, sustained attacks. From the perspective of the defenders, the battle became almost surreal. Survivors later described it as a storm of metal that had no end, a tide of bullets that tore through rock, earth, and flesh alike. Every hour, every ridge cleared, every tunnel destroyed reinforced the same reality. This was not a fight of equals. It was a confrontation between human resilience and the industrial might of a nation fully committed to overwhelming its enemy. By nightfall, the ridge was effectively neutralized. Nakagawa ordered surviving troops to fall back to secondary positions, deeper tunnels and caves, smaller ridges, hoping to slow the inevitable. The Americans paused only briefly, rearming and reorganizing for the next wave of assaults. The battle had already set a grim precedent for the remainder of Peleliu. Firepower on a scale previously unimaginable would determine survival or death. This moment marked the decisive turning point of the battle. Japanese resistance, though disciplined and courageous, was meeting the physical and logistical limits of human endurance. American industrialized firepower had proven the ultimate arbiter, reshaping the battlefield and forcing Nakagawa's forces into a fight they could not win, no matter their strategy or resolve. And as the night settled over Peleliu, the survivors on both sides understood the truth. This battle was no longer measured by skill, bravery, or even strategy. It was measured by how many bullets could be fired and how long human beings could withstand them. The sun rose over Peleliu on September 19, 1944, but it illuminated a battlefield unlike any the Pacific had yet seen. Coral ridges were reduced to jagged skeletons. Smoke hung low, clinging to the broken palms and shattered earth. Everywhere, signs of human cost were unmistakable. The remnants of fortifications, abandoned weapons, and the bodies of those who had been caught in the relentless storm of fire. American officers quickly tallied the numbers. The battle had demanded over 2 million rounds of ammunition in just the initial days, and the consumption continued as Marines advanced through the final defensive lines. Rifles, BARs, machine guns, mortars, and naval artillery had all been used in unprecedented coordination. Ammunition carriers worked tirelessly, shuttling crates from supply points to the front, knowing that any pause could cost lives. For the Japanese defenders, the outcome was stark. Nakagawa's garrison, initially numbering around 10,000 men, had been systematically reduced. Casualty reports indicate that roughly 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers were killed in the first week, with many more wounded. Survivors described a nightmare of endless bullets, tunnels collapsing under fire, and positions rendered untenable. Those who remained faced exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological weight of an enemy whose firepower seemed inexhaustible. The civilian and logistical impact was equally devastating. Coral outcrops that had formed natural defensive strongpoints were pulverized. Vegetation was stripped from ridges, leaving a moonscape of dust and shattered rock. Ammunition crates, spent shell casings, and equipment littered every pathway. Every Marine company kept meticulous logs, recording rounds fired and positions cleared, creating a numerical testament to the scale of the assault. From the Axis perspective, the aftermath was almost surreal. Survivors noted that it felt as though the land itself had been reshaped by bullets. It was not war as we knew it. It was fire. Endless, unforgiving fire. You could not hide, you could not breathe, you could not hope. Only survive.
Meanwhile, American leadership analyzed the operation as proof of doctrine. Overwhelming firepower, coordinated logistics, and relentless suppression could neutralize even the most fortified positions. Every machine gun nest destroyed, every cave collapsed, and every ridge cleared reinforced the conclusion that the industrial might of the United States had become as decisive a weapon as the courage of its Marines. Yet even in victory, the cost was not negligible. Marines suffered heavy casualties during the assault, with hundreds killed or wounded in clearing the final ridges. Ammunition expenditure, while effective, demanded constant resupply under intense combat conditions. This high-cost, high-volume approach would be studied and replicated in subsequent island campaigns, including the assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. By the end of this first phase, the island had become a symbol, a brutal demonstration of what modern industrialized warfare could achieve. For Japanese soldiers, it was a testament to the limits of endurance. For Americans, it was confirmation that doctrine, coordination, and production could overwhelm even the most determined defense. The battlefield was silent now, but the echoes of millions of rounds fired, thousands of lives lost, and the staggering human and material toll lingered. Peleliu had rewritten the rules of engagement in the Pacific. As the smoke cleared over Peleliu, historians and military analysts would later note that the battle had fundamentally altered perceptions of firepower, logistics, and endurance in modern warfare. The numbers alone were staggering. By the end of the first 3 weeks of fighting, U.S. forces had fired an estimated over 2.5 million rounds, supplemented by thousands of artillery shells, mortar rounds, and aerial bombs. The sheer volume of ammunition expended was unprecedented in the Pacific theater. For the Japanese defenders, the aftermath was grim. General Nakagawa's force, once 10,000 strong, was reduced to a fraction of its original size. Estimates suggest that fewer than 1,000 men remained combat effective by the end of September. Survivors were either wounded, trapped in collapsed tunnels, or forced into isolated positions cut off from command. Their sacrifices slowed the American advance only briefly. The overwhelming firepower of the Marines ensured that every defensive position, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually succumbed. American casualties, though lower than the Japanese, were still severe. Hundreds of Marines were killed or wounded in the relentless ridge assaults, and medical personnel worked around the clock to treat burns, gunshot wounds, and injuries caused by collapsing tunnels and debris. The psychological toll was immense. Even seasoned veterans were shaken by the intensity of the combat and the unrelenting barrage of fire. The battle left a lasting impression on military strategy. Peleliu became a case study in the effectiveness of industrialized firepower, demonstrating that sheer volume and coordination of ammunition could neutralize even the most disciplined defenders. The Marines' ability to maintain sustained suppression, constantly resupply ammunition under combat conditions, and methodically clear fortified positions would inform planning for subsequent assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Beyond strategy, Palayu revealed the human limits of warfare. Japanese soldiers exemplified courage and ingenuity, yet no doctrine, no network of tunnels, and no fortification could withstand millions of bullets raining down from disciplined, well-supplied forces. The Americans, meanwhile, witnessed both the effectiveness and the moral weight of overwhelming firepower. What could be measured in rounds fired and ridges cleared could not fully account for the human suffering, the psychological trauma, or the ethical questions surrounding such attrition. Reports from both sides emphasize the sheer scale and intensity of the battle. Japanese soldiers described walls of fire and a storm that never ended, while American officers logged detailed records of ammunition usage to ensure that firepower could be maintained. The lessons were clear. Industrial capacity was now as decisive as courage, and sustained, coordinated fire could determine the outcome of a battle before traditional maneuver or valor even entered the equation. By the time the island was fully secured, Palayu had become more than a battlefield. It was a testament to the transformation of modern warfare, the clash of human endurance against industrialized firepower, a confrontation where preparation, logistics, and relentless aggression dictated the outcome more than traditional tactics or heroism. The island itself bore the scars. Ridges were jagged and bare. Caves, once formidable defensive positions, were destroyed or blocked. Every step through the interior was a reminder of the millions of rounds fired and the lives expended. Palayu would forever stand as a symbol of both human resilience and the terrifying scale of mechanized war. The stage was now set for reflection. The battle had ended, but its lessons for strategy, morality, and the human cost of industrialized warfare would echo far beyond the shores of Palayu. Palayu was not just a battle. It was a revelation, a brutal lesson in the evolution of modern warfare. Here, courage collided with industry. Human endurance met the relentless output of an industrial giant. The clash did not favor strategy or even heroism alone. It favored preparation, logistics, and the capacity to sustain fire on a scale previously unimaginable. For the Japanese defenders, Palayu became a crucible. Men fought with unwavering discipline and extraordinary ingenuity, using every trick, tunnel, and ridge at their disposal. Yet even the most meticulously planned fortifications could not withstand millions of rounds unleashed in coordinated, ceaseless suppression. Their experience highlighted the limits of human resilience against overwhelming material advantage. Courage mattered, but industry decided the outcome. For the Americans, Palayu was confirmation of doctrine and supply. It demonstrated that well-coordinated firepower, relentless suppression, and continuous resupply could reduce even the most formidable defenses to rubble. It reshaped the Pacific Campaign, informing strategies at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. The battle underscored a new reality. Wars of attrition were no longer fought solely with manpower, but with the ability to produce and deliver firepower faster than the enemy could withstand it. Yet beyond tactics and logistics, Palayu carries a moral and human weight. Millions of bullets, countless lives lost, and the relentless destruction of a small island serve as reminders of the cost of industrial war. History measures victories in territory gained, objectives secured, or ridges captured. But the human cost, the psychological, ethical, and physical toll on those who endured the storm of bullets, cannot be measured on a ledger.
Palayu reminds us that modern warfare is both awe-inspiring and terrifying.
It forces reflection on the limits of endurance, the scope of industrial might, and the profound consequences when humanity meets mechanized firepower. The lessons echo far beyond the Pacific, speaking to the nature of courage, the morality of overwhelming force, and the enduring truth that in war, numbers, preparation, and industry can shape destiny as decisively as strategy or valor. And as the wind whispers across the jagged ridges today, the echoes of Peleliu endure, millions of bullets, millions of lives, and a battlefield forever etched into history. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and unimaginable firepower moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and press the bell. Join us as we uncover the untold stories of history that shaped our world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear which battles or moments left you speechless. Every view, every like, every comment helps keep these stories alive.